Hello. My background is in training in history, and I worked in archaeology, and so I'm going to take a slightly different, a long-term overview tack to the issue of activism, basically. And to do this, to illustrate this, I'd like to tell you a story, which is essentially my story, or at least a part of it. When I was growing up as a boy in the United States in the 60s, I was led to believe that we were on the edge, the dawn of a golden age when people would have relative luxury, affluence, without having to engage in a great deal of tedious toil. You would say hard yakka on this side. And that the combination of the technological advances which would minimize the need for labor, together with benevolent capitalism, would provide us with all of these goodies such that there would be, in fact, no poverty. No poverty was a great idea, and this was a dream that I was raised up with, as I suspect many of you were. Without the need for poverty, there's no need for colonies. And during the late 50s and early 60s, most of the colonies were allowed to be self-determining, at least into some form of arrangement with their former colonial masters, which on the surface at least looked a lot more equitable. But the dream of this sort of world where people had maximum leisure and a minimum life commitment to work was one part of what led me to Australia. And I arrived here in May of 1973 at exactly the same time as the Australian Union of Students was out cavorting in the hills around Nimbin. They were experimenting with new ways of communicating with each other, new ways of living, and sustaining themselves on this planet in what they called the Aquarius Festival. And so that was 40 years ago, as you're all aware. And what essentially led me to Australia was the fact that people here were aspiring to a more peaceful, gentler lifestyle. And this was reflected in the Australian government's pulling out of their involvement in the war in Vietnam. Gough Whitlam's government, within one day of being elected, I believe, just said, no, we're out of here, we're canceling our involvement. And as I had been a peace activist in America, I had once been a trainee Army officer, and then I saw the writing on the wall, and then I became active in the peace movement in America. And so this was very attractive to me, a country where ideas were more easily discussed, and I did find a society which was more relaxed, and the attitude towards work, for instance. We had about a 35-hour working week, and most people felt that was a fair cop for, essentially a life of ease, with the possibility of putting in more effort in gainful employment. You can get an easy mortgage, and if you wanted luxury goods, there was such a thing called hire purchase agreements. Many of you will remember them. So I found this society to be a delight. And at that time, feminism was gaining ground in Australia as well as overseas. And within a very short period of time, the women were even allowed in the front bars of Australian pubs. At that time also, education, tertiary education became free, and many women, especially women who were working and mothers, were able to take advantage of that opportunity to study and to advance their careers. So a lot of good things were happening in Australia, and much of it was reflected around the world in terms of unionism and pacifism and environmentalism. And the world that John Lennon asked us to imagine seemed to be just around the corner. But what happened? We're not living that dream today. We were anticipating a 30-hour work week. We were being encouraged to job share. And many people felt that a week's wage for half a week's work was a good thing. Now, that doesn't seem to be where we're at now. I think we need to look back on the 80s and some of the world leaders, which you remember, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Maggie Thatcher recently passed away, not to everyone's dismay. But they had what they called Reaganomics. And it wasn't a particularly new way of thinking, but the basis was Margaret Thatcher is famously quoted as having said, there is no such thing as society, by which I took it to mean that all advances were made by individual effort and not through any collective action. And they went about setting up a world in which the individual was encouraged to aggregate wealth and power, and that this would somehow have a knock-on effect, and that we heard expressions like trickle down, in which the greater affluence would trickle down through the society. We have seen since that time that the movement, the vertical movement, is on the way up. You have a situation now where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and the divide is becoming extreme. The people in the middle are mainly the ones that pay for the state assistance, which is required mainly to finance education, but the state that we were told is not really very necessary and certainly not very useful in terms of economics. This state is financed largely from taxes from the middle class, and this middle class is sort of getting squeezed as we have a large lower class or underclass, which is, their plight is growing more desperate all of the time. So basically, in a large part of the world, the alternative to benevolent capitalism was state-enforced socialism, or what they mistakenly called communism. And as this became more obviously not a beneficent type of situation, but even more brutal in many ways than capitalism, the sort of impetus or the rivalry between the two systems gave way to an arms race. And this arms race basically bankrupted the socialist bloc, led by the Soviet Union, who didn't seem to learn from the American experience in Vietnam, and they had their own disastrous colonial war in Afghanistan, which essentially sent them broke. Then the Iron Curtain was undefended, and the rival to capitalism collapsed. So with the triumph of capitalism in the 90s, you stopped seeing benevolent capitalism and you started to see rampant capitalism. And this can be typified by, let me just give you one example, the electric car. The electric car was something we're still dreaming about, but in California in 1996 they mandated 10% of vehicles would be pollution-free because of growing pollution problems in many parts of the world, but particularly in California. And they mandated 10%. At first, the car manufacturers cooperated, and they made the electric car. And this was so successful that they panicked soon, and they decided that they would recall them, and they could do this because they quite cleverly leased the vehicles rather than sold them outright. They recalled all of these cars, and they basically destroyed them. This is, I know it's hard to believe, but there is a very good documentary of it called Who Killed the Electric Car, put out in 2006. So have a look at that. And essentially they decided that it wasn't good for their profits to sell you a car once, which would then, you could recharge it at home or anywhere. They wanted to sell you a car which they could also sell you fuel for and continue to sell you fuel for. And this is their business model. Now, it's not good for you and it's not good for the environment, but it was good for them. They didn't have to tell you about that because in our modern capitalist system, they don't have to do anything because the government tells them to. And so they didn't bother to explain it at all. And we are now grappling with the same monster, essentially. And there is a movement to try to rein in fossil fuels before all that is left is the pollution that they leave. And many of us are involved in that. We have a long history in the Northern Rivers, and you've heard about a lot of it already today, and you will hear more. In the Northern Rivers, we have a long history of environmental activism and defenders of the planet, particularly of the forest. I'm wearing a shirt to illustrate one of the more recent things. We managed to kick out an elite motorsport rally out of the area a few years ago. And this and the other experiences have given us the experience and the confidence to take on these very large corporations, this system which is supported on all fronts. Because basically, benevolent capitalism doesn't exist. There is two things at work, and Benny mentioned it earlier. It's the dark side and the light side. And I think that we all have to be working for the light side, because I'm now 65. My partner Danielle and I are retired, and we could live out our days on the planet in relative self-indulgent luxury. But we have a daily involvement with 5 adorable grandchildren. And these kids make me wonder and to reflect on what sort of a world will they inherit? What kind of a place will they inhabit in the future? And the choices we make together will decide that future. And so, to me, the word activism is not just a political thing, and it's not just about, particular issues. It's about choices we make throughout our lives and in every aspect of our life. So I believe that we need to rededicate ourselves to the future. And I'm glad to say that in the recent political actions that I've seen, the blockades against the coal seam gas in particular, I am seeing a lot of new leadership, younger people who are stepping forward and contributing their energy, their ideas, and their creativity to building a better world, and I'm able to stand back and be glad. And I would leave you just with one thing that's one of the finest thinkers of our generation, the Dalai Lama. He said that some people need to learn to live more simply so that others can simply live. Thank you.